well, we're still adding a few more people, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this important issue. In this webinar, we will learn about FGMC and hear from advocates on why and how FGMC should be taught in schools and the power of public policy to make this a reality. So Maria, could you move to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. So to start, I want to introduce you all to our speakers. My fellow moderator is Maria. Named one of the 6 experts on female genital cutting, Maria has worked in the anti-gender violence field for over a decade. In 2015, she co-founded SEO, an internationally recognized award-winning organization to empower Asian communities to end female genital cutting. Maria also sits on the inaugural steering committee for the US FGMC network. And just yesterday, it was announced that the Crave Foundation for Women awarded her as one of 5 grant recipients for her work to end FGMC. So congratulations, Maria.
Thanks. So I'm going to actually introduce Hunter since she didn't introduce herself, but Hunter is actually our amazing programs intern who has spearheaded putting together this webinar. And she's currently an undergraduate at Brandeis University studying biology, health, science, society, and policy, and French. And she has been passionate about ending FGC ever since she first learned about it. Hunter aspires to be a gynecologist and perform reconstructive surgeries for survivors of FGC. She is also a student researcher on the FGC project, exploring the knowledge and beliefs of community educators and leaders working towards abandonment of FGC or FGM. So now I'm going to actually turn it back to Hunter to introduce the other speakers.
Thanks, Maria. So the next speaker I want to introduce is Angela Peabody. Maria, could you go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Thank you. So Angela Peabody is the executive director and founder of Global Woman Peace Foundation. This is an organization founded on the principles of eliminating violence and injustices against women and girls. She and her organization have been instrumental in helping get legislation passed in Virginia to criminalize FGMC and have it included in the family life education. She is also the author of 2 books and a training manual on FGMC. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Sure. Does Angela, do you want to say hi really quickly?
Hello.
Hi, Angela. Okay, and the next speaker I want to introduce is Gabriella Euro. She is the Director for English Language Learner Policy and Research for the Council of the Great City Schools. She is the Council's lead for ELL issues related to implementation of the Common Core or new state standards in member districts. Ms. Euro has led or co-authored a number of publications and has secured several $1 million in grant funds to support projects focused on improving instructional rigor for ELLs. Gabriella, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. And then next, Senator Richard H. Black will be joining us. Senator Black has been in the Virginia House and Senate for 16 years. He is a successful and prolific legislator who enacted several bills that made FGC a serious felony and that mandate public school instruction on the physical and legal ramifications of FGM. And we're very excited to have all these great speakers join us.
Great, thank you so much, Hunter, for introducing our speakers. So we're going to just talk a little bit about what the agenda is for the webinar today, and then we will be starting ahead. But just to let everybody know, we do have a lot packed into this agenda, and so if any time you want to ask a question or you would like something repeated, just please feel free to use the chat box. But just to give you an overview of the agenda today, we are going to be going over what FGC is, or female genital cutting, or you might have heard it as female genital mutilation, or FGMC. And we do recognize that we might have people in the audience who have varying backgrounds and knowledge of FGMC, so we felt it was very important to give this quick overview of it, as well as discuss some of the common misconceptions connected to this practice. After that, we will shift towards a discussion around why FGC should be discussed in the school setting, and our speakers will be able to speak on that topic as well. And then finally, we will end with sharing some resources, and there will be time for a Q&A as well. So again, since we do have quite a tight agenda and a lot to cover, we are hoping that if participants have any questions, that you will be able to start up a conversation in the chat box as well. And we really do encourage you to do so throughout the webinar. Okay, to start with, because again, we do have participants with varying knowledge, we would love it if participants could tell us in the chat box what they believe FGMC is, or FGC or FGM. And please just describe what you believe it is. And as folks are doing that, I will just go over then what the official definition is given by the World Health Organization. So female genital mutilation or cutting comprises all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. It is recognized internationally as a human rights violation, torture, and an extreme form of violence against women and girls, and it is usually performed between birth and puberty, although it also does happen in adults. And there are many different names, as I mentioned, for female genital cutting or mutilation. And actually later on in this presentation, we'll address briefly the topic of terminology around this practice. So as mentioned, there are various forms of female genital mutilation or cutting, and the WHO has actually categorized this into 4 types. In general, these 4 categories are very broad in themselves, but to give you just a brief definition, we have an illustration of the different types. But type 1, it ranges from type 1 to type 4, and in general, it ranges from the least severe forms, type 1, to the most severe forms, type 3. And then type 4 often includes other forms of female genital cutting that are in the first 3 categories. So type 1 usually involves around excision of the clitoral hood with or without removal of the entire clitoris. Type 2 is partial or total removal of the clitoris and the labia minora with or without excision of the labia majora. Type 3 is narrowing of it can be narrowing of the vaginal orifice with creation of a covering seal by cutting or appositioning the labia minora and labia majora. And then type 4 again is, this other category that can be pricking, piercing, cauterizing. And each one of those categories in themselves very much are broad in terms of what can happen. And just again, a reminder, we're quickly going over this overview. So we could definitely spend a lot more detail and go into depth, but we just want to give a quick overview to ensure that everybody on this call has an equal understanding about what we're talking about today. There are many consequences of undergoing female genital cutting, and there can be lifelong health consequences that start right after being cut into all stages of girls' lives. So if you are familiar with FGMC and would actually like to type in the chat box some of the effects of FGMC that you are familiar with or that you have heard, please do so right now too, because we also recognize that there are experts in the audience, and so we would love to hear from you as well. But to highlight just a few, FGMC can include chronic infection, hemorrhage, severe pain during urination, menstruation, and during sexual intercourse as well as the other items listed on the PowerPoint. FGMC also can affect survivors' mental health. And this is an area of research that has only really started to be collected or recognized in the past few years. But some consequences can include poor sleep, fatigue, generalized body aches, poor self-perception or well-being, among others. And to reiterate the effects of FGMC on one's mental health, we wanted to show a video from a project called Voices to End FGMC, which is a collaboration between SEO, the organization I helped co-found, and another organization, Story Center. And this project really aimed to bring people together to share and heal from their experiences with FGMC, really help survivors to connect and potentially grow as leaders in their communities, and to really share short videos calling for an end to this harmful practice. So throughout this webinar, we'll show a couple of these videos, but we wanted to show this to give you a sense of an experience from a survivor's point of view. So in this first video, we're actually going to be hearing from Tasneem discuss the mental health consequences she has experienced and how she really searched for validation for her pain. So I'm going to be turning on this video now. And it's a short video as well.
When I turned 40, I felt brave enough to seek counseling. It took me a long time to be ready to deal with the grief and trauma of FGM and the guilt I experienced after speaking up about it and exposing my family and culture's dirty secret. Once I began counseling, I wanted to know firsthand what was done to me and if it would explain why I was childless. Up to that point, all the medical professionals I had seen for various reasons over the years had completely ignored my FGM during examinations. This time, I got an appointment with a female FGM specialist. I told her my FGM was done in a medical setting when I was 7 years old. After examining me, the doctor said that what happened to me had nothing to do with whether or not I could get pregnant. Then she said, women's vaginas and clitorises come in different shapes and forms. Every woman's body is different. I can't see any visible scarring. You could have been born this way with no visible clitoris. Looking back now, I think she meant to be kind and put my mind at ease. But her words that meant to offer comfort only caused more suffering. I had wanted a doctor's validation, an acknowledgement that the FGM was real and not something only in my mind. Instead, her failure to listen to what I had told her about being cut and her focus on the lack of physical evidence just emphasized the pain. I'm lucky I was mutilated in a way that left no scarring, but FGM is about more than bodily harm. After a year of counseling, I've got some closure and perspective, and yet nothing will erase the sense of loss I feel at what was done to me without my consent.
All right. So again, because we recognize we don't have enough time, we can't really discuss the video, but we would really welcome you to share your reflections or your thoughts about this video in the chat box as well. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Hunter.
Thank you, Maria. So in addition to the impact FGMC can have on mental health, I also want to discuss the impact FGMC can have on one's sexuality. In 2017, SEO conducted a study in which 385 women from the Boer community took part. So of the 309 respondents who had undergone FGC, 35% believed that FGC affected their sexual life. 32% just weren't sure if it had. And part of this is also including just a lack of awareness in general about the female anatomy and how things function. Oh, and to explain the graphic, Khatna is the term for FGMC that is used in the Boer community, which is a Shia Islamic sect originating from India. So going on, of the 32% who responded that FGMC affected their lives, 87% said it affected their lives negatively. So why is it performed? FGMC is considered a social norm within communities. So this means that it has been justified in all sorts of ways so that it can continue generation after generation. Some reasons given for its continuation in many communities include curbing sexual desire, religion, culture, tradition, marriageability, cleanliness, and even to enhance sexual pleasure. Right now in the chat box, please feel free to mention other reasons you've heard for justifying FGM. It's also important to note that the reasons FGC is performed can also shift over time within a community. So for instance, for many years in the Boer community, one of the central ideas of why FGC was performed was this idea that women were not supposed to be sexual. However, now many religious authorities from the Boer community tend to promote the idea that FGC is a religious requirement over the idea that women are not supposed to be sexual. Next slide, please. So I also want to make a general note about terminology. When working with survivors or communities that practice FGC, SEO has found that it's always best to mirror their language. So for example, using the term circumcision if that's the word the community is using, even if this is not your preferred terminology. So mirroring the language they use can be helpful in continuing to engage in dialogue with the community versus being immediately dismissed. And continued dialogue can be essential to shifting norms and ideas around FGC. So to discuss terminology a little bit more, I want to look at FGM, female genital mutilation, versus FGC, female genital cutting. So some prefer to use FGM, and to quote the UN, the use of the word mutilation reinforces the fact that the practice is a violation of girls' and women's rights, and thereby helps to promote national and international advocacy for its abandonment. And others prefer to use FGC in order to avoid the stigmatization of practicing communities. And FGC also acknowledges that those who practice FGC don't have the intention of mutilating their daughters. So both these terms refer to the same set of practices, and there are varying reasons to use either term. And other terms you may hear that also refer to FGC include female sexual mutilation, excision, female circumcision, and of course colloquial terms that can be found in the practicing communities themselves. And if you've heard other terms used to refer to FGC, please mention them in the chat box. I already see some people doing that, that's great. So more terms I'd like to discuss are survivor and victim. So at SEO, we utilize the word survivor when referring to women and girls who have undergone FGC. And we do so because survivor can be thought of as a more empowering term by emphasizing resilience. So the word victim can connotate passivity and helplessness, whereas survivor can acknowledge the violence a woman has been through, yet emphasizes an active role in overcoming that violence. And again, we note that women who have undergone it themselves might have a separate idea about how they want to be referred. And so it's always good to check in with them on what they prefer. So lastly, I want to emphasize the importance of avoiding use of alienating language. Alienating language can include terms that are demeaning to the communities that practice FGC. They could also promote discrimination and reinforce stereotypes. So othering language negates the fact that FGC is a universal concern and a human rights issue. And so some examples of alienating language include barbaric, savage, and butchery, as these words neglect the complicated nature and nuances of why and how the practice continues, and make it more difficult to engage in communities to try to end it. Language is really important to activism, so if anyone has any other lessons they've learned about language, please feel free to share them in the chat box.
Great, thank you, Hunter. And thank you for everybody who is participating in the chat box too. We definitely really want to be able to learn from each other as well throughout this webinar. So we appreciate that. So next we wanted to really just briefly go through some common misconceptions, and then we want to spend the majority of the time with the speakers. So we felt like it was important to address some of these these common misconceptions, because as we were talking about teaching FGMC in the classroom, oftentimes misconceptions can be harmful to both survivors and to the overall movement to abandon FGMC. So one misconception is that FGC is considered a religious practice. And the fact is that FGMC is really a harmful social norm, often justified in various manners, which can include religion, but no religion should promote harm for a child. And I think it's important to also recognize that FGMC predates Christianity and Islam. Oftentimes it's actually attributed to belonging to just Muslim communities, but in fact many religions do find FGMC performed within them. Many religious leaders also condemn it. And I think it's also important to recognize that some religious texts and some sects might mention female genital cutting, and this is true for the Bora community, but it is not called for in any of the major texts, particularly within the major Abrahamic religions such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism. However, it also is just important to recognize when you're working with communities that it can be thought to be a religious tradition. But again, even if it is that case, I think an important point to recognize is that no religion should be promoting harm to a child. So with that in mind, to further explore just the global nature of FGMC and to highlight that this is a practice that does happen in various communities, we wanted to share Jenny's story. Jenny comes from a fundamentalist Christian community, and she underwent FGMC as a young girl here in the United States. And again, because of time restrictions, we won't really be able to chat about the video, but we really do encourage people to share the reflections in the chat box. And I will start the video now.
When I think about who I am, where I've been, I think of you too. There is so much I wish I could say. Remember when we were little, the plays that we would do, dressing up in whatever we could find. You always cast my doll in our family plays, knowing that my baby bottoms was my favorite. My doll was with us when we boarded that plane. As we flew through the clouds, I said, "Look, we get to be like birds today." We laughed so much. You said, "This has been one of my best days." The next morning, Baby Bottoms was with me when I was led down the basement stairs. I held her tight as I was put on the cold metal table. Later, I saw her on the dirt floor with my blood on her dress. I could never play with her again. She knew my shame. You knew it too. Why wasn't it something we could share? Did you have the same confusion and pain that I felt every day? Did you get in trouble in school for going to the bathroom too often or taking too long? I already had 5 kids when my new obstetrician asked, "What happened to you?" Did anyone ever ask you? Did you ever wonder why God made it a sin for girls to share? Did you learn you were different in human anatomy class too? After it happened, I heard you scream in the night sometimes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that what was done to us invaded my dreams too. I'm sorry you never got to share your story. I miss you every day. Keep dancing, sister. Keep being free.
That was a really powerful story, which I think also helps to disprove this really common myth that FGC is an African practice. The fact is, FGC is practiced all over the globe, including in the US. Next slide, please. Thank you. So only in the last few years has the UN recognized FGC as occurring globally. A report found that FGMC is found in 92 countries around the world. A lot of the countries not recognized where FGMC is happening are in Asia. So now I want to talk about FGC in the US. 2012 data shows that 500,000 women and girls have undergone or are at risk of FGMC in the US. But this data actually underrepresents the number due to limitations in the study. Participants only included immigrant populations from only 30 countries. So that doesn't include second and third generation women from other parts of the world where FGMC is also practiced. So FGC in the US and Europe are often attributed to migration from African countries. But up until the 50s, FGC was used in the US and Europe as a cure for women's hysteria or nymphomania. And as Jenny's story demonstrated, there are still white American girls undergoing FGC today as well.
So that brings us to another misconception, this idea that medicalization can make FGC safe. And medicalization refers to the practice of female genital cutting by any healthcare professional. And within some practicing communities, medicalization of the practice has occurred with the idea in mind that if the health professional performs it, it will make it safer. However, even with medicalization, oftentimes negative consequences of FGC can occur, such as psychological trauma, the knife can slip, nerve damage can happen, bleeding, infection. Healthcare workers are often considered respected members of the community, so their practice of FGC can actually potentially strengthen the overall practice and continuation within a community. And I think it's important to remember that doctors do take an oath to do no harm. So performing FGC actually breaks that oath, as FGC has no physical or psychological benefits. And we're going to show one more video, just a short video of the story of Rene Bergstrom, who, like Jenny, is a young girl living in the US who underwent FGC. And in her case, the person who cut her was a medical professional. So let's watch her story.
I was born in 1944 to a loving Midwestern American farm family. We were close to the earth and our animals. When I was 3, my mother became concerned that my face turned red when I touched my clitoris. She brought me to a doctor, and the doctor cut me. My mother said, "Don't ever talk about this." I was alone with my questions as a child, teenager, and young adult. I did not discuss nerve damage discomfort, even with my sisters. When I gave birth to my first child, I did not talk about the complications I faced. I wanted a natural labor, but the doctor didn't know what to do. He put me under to perform an extensive episiotomy. I awoke 4 hours after my daughter was born, and it took my body months to heal. I told a couple from my church about what had happened to me as a child. They said, "Don't ever tell that story again." Later, I shared with women at work who said, "Don't repeat that or you'll ruin your career." But is this really my shame? What about other women having their babies with doctors who don't know what to do? I could not stay silent, and I started reaching out to new people. My Somali friend Filsan Ali and I produced a bilingual brochure for infibulated Somali women to give to their doctors to make safe labor and delivery plans. I went public internationally, and my close friends and family supported me. Creating art and connecting with nature has helped me heal. I've learned to spin wool and weave on a loom. I have found peace in flower gardens, weeding, deadheading, and making bouquets. Today I live where eagles soar and deer feed by a river. I hope my story will help people be aware that girls have been cut in cultures throughout the world.
Great. So again, we don't have time to really discuss the video, but feel free to share any reflections you might have in the chat box. And just as a recap, we wanted to show this video because it also shows medicalization of the practice, but as well as potential psychological consequences, including loneliness and shame, which Rene talked about, and other physical consequences such as nerve damage and complication during childbirth. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Hunter again.
So another myth I want to address is that undergoing FGC is a choice. And this myth is two-pronged. So to start, I want to talk about the lack of consent. Sometimes it's argued that FGC can be practiced as long as the girls are old enough to consent. However, consent cannot be given when there is coercion. We know that FGC often exists as a result of societal pressure placed on girls who are told FGC is necessary for them to be a woman, to be a member of their own culture and society, and to be married. So for these reasons, consent cannot be freely given to undergo FGC because coercion will always be a dangerous factor. So another argument we see in regards to this myth is that FGC is not a form of gender-based violence because it's performed by women on girls, meaning that the cutters are normally women. Yet underlying notions for why FGC continues can be due to gendered roles regarding how a woman should or should not behave. These views can stem from patriarchal societies. So, for example, common motivations for FGC that fall under this realm often include marriageability, curbing sexual desire, ensuring a girl is a virgin, and ensuring the girl will not commit adultery. Next slide, please. So these quotes from Comfort Diazadi, an FGC survivor, help demonstrate how gendered roles can perpetuate the practice. She underwent painful labia elongation at the age of 9. She had an allergic reaction to the herbs used for the practice. She suffered multiple infections, a painful childbirth, and inevitably needed to undergo surgery. So she says, the men in our culture expect you to have labia the length of your middle finger. Psychologically, it tells a girl that you're not enough. She said, you need to alter something, and there's something deep about telling a young lady that age that you need to make yourself this way for a man, that you're not good enough. There's even stories about women who get returned from their marriage, that they need to go and pull that labia longer. It's very damaging to women. It places the value of the man over the woman. Comfort's story very clearly shows the patriarchal motivations to the practice of FGC in her community.
All right, and so the last misconception that we wanted to address is that FGC is often thought of as a cultural practice, therefore we shouldn't condemn it. And I think it's important to recognize that FGC is a very complex issue that can have lasting trauma on women and girls who undergo it, and is something we should work towards preventing. It is a global issue, and it's something that we should address, that anybody who is willing to help to be should really be involved in this movement. But it's important also to educate yourself on the topic and to connect with those who have knowledge and expertise of the communities where this might occur, so that you can bring sensitivity to your work or how you view this issue as well. These were just some of common misconceptions we wanted to address. We know that there are others out there, and we would love it again if any of you who are watching this webinar would be willing to share in the chat box misconceptions you've heard, and also being able to correct those misconceptions for us too. And then with that, I'm going to shift it over to Hunter again.
Thank you, Maria. Could you go to the next slide, please? So to shift gears, we're now going to focus on why and how we should discuss FGC in the classroom. So we want to ask a question of you all first. So for those of you who already do so, for any educators in the audience, why do you choose to teach about FGC in your class? And if you're not an educator, please feel free to share reasons that you feel FGC should or should not be brought into the classroom. And while people type their answers, we can go on to the next slide.
Great. So as people type reasons for why they feel it's important to teach FGC in the classroom, we wanted to just help everyone start thinking a little bit about this. And a couple of reasons that we wanted to offer up is that we really want to be able to promote ending the thinking that FGC is something that only affects other communities, which is something that can be a barrier when we're trying to provide support services and prevention services as well for those girls and women who do need it. We want to be able to teach about FGC so we can create awareness. And also we want to be able to correct myths and misinformation, such as we've been trying to do so on this webinar as well. So we also wanted to bring up some examples of how it could be taught or where it could be taught. I do see there was a question about what age are we discussing. And we are going to have speakers that are talking about how they utilize education in various levels, but we wanted to start with thinking about if it is something that can be brought up in secondary school level, higher levels. I'm sure there are people on this call that have experience with other ages. In terms of higher levels, what some of the thoughts were around being able to teach about it in anthropology and women and gender studies and in law. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Hunter because she was the brainchild behind this webinar and it's based out of personal experience in a class that she attended. So Hunter, would you be able to share your experience?
Yeah, so I wanted to include anthropology in an example here because I think that in anthropology, FGC could be used as a great example of ending a harmful practice using a cultural relativist lens, meaning approaching it understanding why the people who practice FGC do so. Unfortunately, in my university, FGC isn't really taught this way in anthropology classes. It's often taught in a way that undermines efforts to end the practice by emphasizing the importance of culture in these communities. But this misconception was already addressed. I just want to reiterate that it's so important to never use culture to justify something that hurts a child. And there's ways to approach abandoning FGC that do address culture. I'll hand it back to you, Maria.
Thanks, Hunter. So I think what we want to do now is actually hand it over to Angela from the Global Women Peace Foundation. We're really lucky to have her here with us today to discuss her work training teachers, students, and school officials on FGC. So with that, Angela, would you be willing to share your experiences with us?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, first of all, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody in the audience. Well, ever since I began this work against FGMC, I've always insisted that education is the surest road to ending the practice. So my organization and I developed the Kids Reach Shield program to help educate community, law enforcement, school nurses and teachers about the harmful practice of FGMC, including the cultural traditions. When we discovered that many law enforcers and teachers were very unfamiliar with the practice. These are some of the frontliners, we thought, who have close contact with girls at risk on only a daily basis when school is in session. We wrote to school officials and law enforcement with a plan to introduce the practice of FGMC to their personnel. We initially received some backlash, but we were persistent in making our case and we were finally invited to begin our training to law enforcement. In February of 2018, we began our law enforcement training, and after training 4 counties of detectives, officers, and CPS, Child Protective Services agents in the Washington, D.C. metro area, we were also invited to train a total of 45 FBI agents on the cultural traditions of FGMC. The more difficult piece was engaging school officials. Some of them were not convinced that the training was necessary, and some of them still are not convinced to date. After an unsuccessful trip to Richmond to address the Virginia Board of Education and several persistent correspondences, we were finally invited to conduct an online introductory training to Virginia school administrators for them to determine what would be involved in the teachers' training process. The session was successful, and several school administrators contacted us after the webinar. We began training school nurses in the spring of 2017 in Northern Virginia, and it quickly caught on. Then we were invited to be a part of a panel to train the National Association of School Nurses in the summer of 2018. Nurses from all over the US, including Hawaii and Alaska, were present at that convention. That day, FGMC gained a great deal of exposure to school nurses in the US. From that exposure, we were invited to train the Virginia Association of School Nurses in the fall of 2018. In late 2016, we were approached by the Virginia State Senator, Richard Black, to get our support of a bill he was about to put forth in the Virginia Senate to have FGMC criminalized in the Commonwealth of Virginia. 3 years later, Senator Black was not quite done with FGMC. He called us again in January of 2019 to testify for an education bill to include FGMC in the family life education school curriculum in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We were successful, and the bill passed through both the House and the Senate. Once the bill was signed into law in 2019, we were approached by the school administrators to revisit the possibility of teachers training and a school curriculum. We were working on that possible curriculum and training program when suddenly everything was shut down due to COVID-19. We are still working on a special curriculum, but with social distancing in consideration. Prior to COVID-19 social distancing this year, we were invited to conduct a lecture on FGMC to the senior high social science class at Freedom High School in Loudoun County, Virginia. With the exception of 3 students in that class, the rest of the class had never heard of FGMC. They were astounded by what they learned by the end of the lecture. During the Q&A, a total of 33 questions were asked by the students, and they wanted to know how they could get involved, how could they help to end the practice. After working with school administrators, nurses, teachers, child protective services, and detectives, those high school children were the final test that proved to us the much needed and necessity for education in the schools on FGM. They did such an impressive job that day that I sent them complimentary t-shirts from our 2019 event, and their teacher took a photo of them, as you see in the photo there. Again, I believe that the surest way to ending the practice is to educate the children and young people so they will not continue the practice in the future. Teaching children from an early age that any form of violence is not admirable, acceptable, and helps to eliminate such behavior. Thank you, and I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Gabriella, who will talk about the importance of school resource.
Thank you so much, Angela, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's truly on behalf of our organization, the Council of Great City Schools, it's a true honor to be considered a partner in this important work of eradicating FGM or FGC practices worldwide. I had the honor to meet Angela and her important work a few years ago when we jointly developed the resource for schools that you see shown on the slide. Angela's important work has led to groundbreaking legislation, as well as important education efforts focused on school professionals and students. These important milestones and efforts can go even farther when school systems and their leaders are full partners in supporting the prevention of FGC or FGM. And in particular, in the US, which is why we decided to create this resource, it's particularly unique because in the US, while the states set the standards, the education curriculum and standards, and so in the case of Virginia passing the criminalization and then requiring that in the health and family education curriculum, prevention of FGM be considered and included. That pertains to Virginia, but that doesn't mean that in the case of Massachusetts or California, it might be also taught. And so it's really important that as we want to amplify the efforts of prevention, we need to empower educators to really understand what these practices are and really lock arms to prevent this practice. And so during the development of the resource for US schools, we understood the importance of this broader context to bring into the prevention efforts. At the same time, as we talked with Angela and the other people that were involved in this document, we realized that educators and administrators in our US schools needed education and guidance on how to prevent FGM and how to provide support to girls and young women who may be at risk or may be survivors of such practices. And this is what we set out to do. So the goal for our work was the physical and emotional well-being of young girls and women in our schools. As we explored what this resource would look like, certain non-negotiables emerged as clear guides to our work. Number one, it was clear that we had to include important content. And as has been discussed during this webinar today, it was clear that we had to have facts about FGM to dispel the myths, facts about the US law with regard to FGM. And then we also had to provide curated and relevant information for educators and staff in schools, from nurses to teachers to counselors and school administrators, so they knew what to do to prevent FGM, as well as how to support young girls and women who they might encounter who were survivors of such practices or are at risk. The second and very important non-negotiable is the cultural responsiveness and proficiency were important non-negotiables, both in terms of content as well as the tone that would be used in this resource document. And why is this? Well, we had to make sure that our message was conveyed, it's important information, and it was conveyed in a way that was sensitive and respectful of the cultures, while at the same time condemning a practice that is not healthy for our girls and young women. But it was difficult and it was a challenge because this is a topic of discussion that rarely comes up in US education. And just in general, if you look at how school districts across the country deal with health education, I can tell you even for my own children in Virginia, you have to sign an agreement that you agree with the topics that will be covered in health education that many include sex education, right? So it can very easily and very quickly become controversial. We can go to the next slide, please. So in order to create this multifaceted resource document, we assembled a team that included FGM prevention advocates, relevant community organizations, a relevant federal agency, as well as the Council of Great City Schools. Our organization, just by way of background, is a national organization that represents 75 of the nation's largest urban school districts in the US. We are 75 districts that enroll over 7 million students. And just for those of you that are not familiar with the US system, we have about 15,000 school districts. And you might think, well, what can 75 school districts do? Well, we actually enroll a very large number of students in our school systems because they're so large. So when we worked with all these individuals, Angela Peabody was the guiding light for our work. And together with members from the Ethiopian Community Development Council, they really set the guardrails to ensure that our document was culturally responsive and factually correct. So we knew we were working with the right folks to create this document. The Council of Great City School staff made sure that we provided what were the school setting parameters. They would allow us to ensure the document was accessible to our educators, but also practical for educators to use in the prevention of FGC, as well as to provide systems of support for students who may be at risk or are survivors of such practice. If you can go to the next slide, please. The prevention of FGC requires the involvement of caring communities, both inside and outside of schools. FGM is a practice that poses a danger to young girls and women that span nations, cultures, and religions, as we've heard today. The urgent need to eradicate this practice across the world also affects many young girls and young women in the US schools. And one of the cases that we were reading, and I think Hunter mentioned the statistic in 2012 when they were looking at 500,000 girls that were at risk in the US. We looked at that data and realized that 40% of those girls were in one of our 5 cities. So we knew that as an organization, we really needed to walk in lockstep with Angela and her efforts to prevent FGM. So the information provided to US schools regarding FGM, I would say is either inadequate, is insufficient, or it might even be erroneous. So we knew it was imperative that schools reached out to relevant community organizations to collaborate in ensuring that young girls are safe from FGM and supporting the healing of girls and women who have undergone such practice. So in our document, we encourage schools and school districts, as well as suggest ways for them to reach out to the relevant community and faith-based organizations to assist in the efforts of FGM prevention. This is important to ensure that supports and the processes put in place are culturally appropriate and respectful to support the young girls and young women. A realistic premise of ours when we developed this document was that schools have little experience and more than likely no robust protocols to help prevent FGM or to support survivors. We wanted our document to serve as a resource that would allow them to develop some viable and culturally responsive support plans in the context of US schools and US law. If you can go to the next slide, please. So in the document, we suggest sort of like a 5-step process for developing protocols that would really help in the prevention of FGM, but also supporting the girls, especially the physical and emotional well-being. We called on districts to very early on in the process, when they realize that there's something amiss, that pull together the necessary stakeholders who can inform and intentionally develop a well thought out strategy to protect the physical and emotional well-being of at-risk girls and young women. And this means that there are certain stakeholders in the school community that will be important to make sure they're there, including, for example, counselors and school nurses, but even enlisting teachers and administrators that can really be supportive. But very importantly, though, we also, as I indicated before, is reaching out to the community to understand who in the community can help the school have an effective and supportive response for girls. The protocol process makes it clear to schools that they need to build their own capacity, both in terms of factual awareness about FGM, as well as the protocols that they would put in place to support girls. And we wanted to make sure that schools sort of were recognized and saying, look, we know that you might not know much about this, but it's important that you try to build a capacity and you invest in your staff and in protocols to support girls. If we can go to the next slide. So finally, what we did is we included in our document user-friendly and accessible one-pager that were summaries, very much focusing on particular stakeholders or personnel in the schools, because they each have, they come in contact with their young girls in different roles and ways. They might see different signs, and we wanted to make sure that when we gave information to our school staff, it was customized to what we know that they might be encountering with such students. And so these one-pagers, which were made this way so they can be easily copied in schools. You don't have to have the whole document. You can just pull out these one-pagers and copy them and distribute them to the relevant staff. But they included factual information, signs to identify girls who might be at risk or are survivors and they need to be supported. Reminders, every single time we had a reminder to ensure that the social and emotional well-being of the student was first and foremost in any educator's mind, as well as suggested action steps to support the girls and to address the FGM prevention efforts. This document is available for free. You can download it. We have it available on the council's website, but also Angela has it on the Global Women Peace website. And in fact, we created two versions. One was in color and the other one was black and white, so that it's also just a little bit more user-friendly for printing. And we were very proud of the work that we did with Angela, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was so interesting and informative. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the day, former Virginia Senator Richard Black. Senator Black was instrumental in passing a bill that incorporates FGC into family life education. So Senator Black, please feel free to turn on your camera and tell us more about this bill. Senator Black, we're ready for you.
Am I on the screen right now?
Look, sounds like we can hear you, but your video is not on.
Video's not on. Now, let me
see.
see. Let me try this. Start your video. Okay, start my video. Here we go.
Oh, there you are. Perfect.
Okay. Okay,
Oh,
so you can see me.
background.
I can't see myself, but I guess if you can see me, that's fine. Okay, so you have video and audio right now, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Well, let me give you a little rundown. We started off, Angela Peabody brought this to my attention through some literature that she placed on my desk in the General Assembly. While I was cleaning off the desk, I looked through all of the glitzy, glamorous magazines and things, and I found this one small homemade publication about the FGM. I read it and was really astounded. I was not familiar with the practice. I did not know about it, but it was obviously something of of grave importance and something that apparently is a threat to about 500,000 people, 500,000 girls. And so I embarked on a tremendous struggle to get this built into the Virginia Code. The first year I introduced the bill, I tried to make FGM a felony for anyone who caused it or helped to aid and abet in the process. Because of budget constraints, we couldn't do that, but finally, after a lot of negotiation, they agreed to make it a misdemeanor. However, what was most important was not getting a misdemeanor, which, you know, those are typically not treated very seriously by the system. But what was important is that we created a civil cause of action. So we gave to the girl the ability, once she came of age, to sue anyone who participated in bringing about her mutilation. It might be a parent, it might be a friend, it might be the person who actually did the cutting, or perhaps people who helped her to travel abroad for one of these so-called celebrations. And so we got that through, and then the next year we upgraded it to a very, very serious felony in Virginia. And then the third year, which really was the capstone, and it was kind of where I was headed, was to educate the young students about what the practice was, the penalty for participating in the practice, and the civil lawsuit that the girls could bring, where they could bring suit against the people who had caused this terrible thing to happen to her. It was never my objective to cause a lot of people to engage in lawsuits or even to throw a lot of people in jail. My objective from the outset was to change a very damaging cultural practice that had been becoming ingrained in American culture through immigration, and basically to stamp it out so that it wouldn't exist in the United States. Anyone who has had children who have grown up and they become teenagers and go on, you know, there is this rebellious stage, and I'm keenly aware of it. And to me, the parents who caused FGM to be inflicted on their children had to have in their minds, you know, if we do this, our daughter may not be under our thumb, and she may start thinking for herself, and maybe she will bring a lawsuit against us that literally bankrupts the family. And so the whole idea of this was to suppress the practice, to abolish it in this country. And of course, you know, we're trying to abolish it worldwide, but we need to start at home. And the idea was that we would abolish the practice here using the threat of lawsuits. Now, in order for this to work, we had to make sure that people were aware of the penalty and of the possibility of a lawsuit. And this is the reason that I introduced Senate Bill 1159. This was sort of the capstone piece of legislation, and it was designed to use our family life education program in Virginia, and through that program to have a block of instruction that would inform students about FGM and inform them of their legal rights to bring suit. This is still in progress. I retired from the Senate in January, so I couldn't tell you precisely where they stand, but I do know that the legislation garnered a great deal of bipartisan support, and people felt like it should go forward. And so I expect that it continues to move forward. Right now, our schools are closed for the most part, but hopefully when they open up, we will start to see this instruction for the children at the schools. So my hope is that from the seeds that were planted by Angela Peabody and the people working with her, that we will eventually stamp out this practice in the United States and go on to stamp it out throughout the world.
Thank you, Senator Black. We really appreciate you speaking to us today and for all of the work that you've done. And thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers. So Maria, could you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. So we're going to send out the slides so everyone will have all of these resources. And we're reaching the end of our event, so we'll now move on to a question and answer portion. So please send your questions in the chat box. If they're for a specific speaker, make sure to address them. And we're excited to answer your questions.
And I also just want to mention, because I was seeing in the chat box quite a few folks who were mentioning if we were going to be sending the video out, and then also if we could send the actual chat box, because I know there's a lot of helpful information in there. And yes, we will definitely be able to send the video out. We'll try to send the chat as well, and make sure that you have links to all of our resources as well. All right, so if folks want to, again, just write out any questions that you might have in the chat box, that would be wonderful.
This is Gabriella. Can I just, there was a question in there and I did answer, but I want to make sure that everybody knew that the resource that Angela and the council worked on is freely available. There's no copyright. I think we're thinking about updating it to have more good news about the states that are outlawing the practice or criminalizing the practice. And we'll make sure that we include something like a Creative Commons license so people know that they can use it at their will.
Thanks, Gabriella, for that. And I do see a couple of questions coming up. One is a broad question, but I'll throw it out there. It says, is the best way forward to go through state legislatures? So that's just a general question in terms of, I think, relating to how policy can be used as a tool for education on this issue.
Well, I personally think that it is. The federal government has had some play in this, but the fact is that the states have the greater power to take action on it. It's probably focused in certain states, and so if they can get involved. But the key is always to remember that whatever they do, just imposing criminal penalties is not enough. They need to create a civil cause of action so that people can file suit. Ultimately, that's what will stop it.
Thank you. Let's see. So another question is, how would you approach prevention education on this topic, inclusive and mindful of various gender identities regarding FGMC? Does anyone have any thoughts?
I didn't get the question.
I think on this. Perhaps Gina, could you rephrase the question? But so the question was really regarding, so how would you approach prevention education on this topic, inclusive and mindful of various gender identities regarding FGMC?
I think what this question is referring to is that we often refer to survivors as women and girls, but just because a person's undergone FGMC doesn't necessarily mean that they identify as a woman or a girl. I think that's a really important point.
Well, I'll answer. I'll try to answer that question based on how we are formulating our curriculum for the schools in Virginia. We are designing it for both genders, for boys and girls, and we stress the importance of educating boys as well as girls on FGMC, because I had two boys. I always give myself as an example. My family, I have two sons, and from early ages, I taught them not to hit a girl and not to engage in violence, even with their friends. It's always best to walk away or try to make peace and end the conflict in peace, in a peaceful way. And so I think, and they grew up knowing that, and they both got married, and they would not hit their wives. So my contention is teach the boys equally about the dangers of FGM and the risks, the health risks, as much as you teach the girls.
Thank you, Angela. That's so true. FGMC is not just a woman's issue. So another question I'm seeing is, how can the average person, an audience member, help or educate on this subject?
So I think one basic thing is just being able to connect with those who are experts, do basic research on this issue. There are a lot of amazing organizations out there, a lot of amazing websites, a lot of amazing just documentaries, books, things like that. That's a very basic level, something that you can do to be better educated, but also reach out to those organizations and see what they might recommend. Reach out to communities where they are providing prevention support services and try to find out what kind of resources they might recommend as well. This being part of this webinar and seeing just the plethora of resources being shared in the chat box too, that's another way of helping to educate yourself too.
I can add to that. I think the work that we did at the council is one example, right? So the council, we were unaware of this. It was brought to our attention. And so what we did is like, okay, we need to be educated on this. We do not know this. Our girls are in our schools. And so that's where we are also in our guide telling schools to do the same thing. We knew that we had to work with Angela, and we worked with Angela and some other colleagues that came to the table to learn about this and then do something that would help support the prevention efforts.
Thank you, Maria and Gabriella. So another question I've seen a few times is, what are other states doing? Are they doing things similar to Virginia? And so while I don't know about other US states, I do know there are some countries that also have policy requiring education about FGC, for example, England. Do any of our speakers know more about what other states are doing?
So it is very individualized by state. I'm actually based in Massachusetts, and we have been trying to pass law for quite a few years, and it is currently today being taken up by the Massachusetts Senate floor, and so we're very hopeful that it'll pass. It passed out of the House a couple weeks ago. And our legislation does provide for community education and outreach, as well as also civil remedies and criminalizing FGMC. So our first step is really, we're kind of behind Virginia. We're hoping that this will pass, and that then we can move on towards looking at what kind of curriculum we create and how we can provide more outreach and education within the state too. But states are at various levels, and it's also just according to what the legislation is within a state. Overall, I can tell you that there are 12 states in the US that currently do not have any sort of legislation in connection to FGMC. So there's still a lot of work to be done within the United States at the state level.
I do know that an organization in Maryland reached out to us and asked for advice on moving forward and approaching their state legislators to see, to explore the possibility of putting FGM into schools and having that law passed in the state of Maryland. Especially so, it's one of our neighbors, our bordering states. So we offered to assist them in any way, and we would be happy to even put them in touch with Senator Black, because I think he has caused Virginia to set the example.
You know, it is sometimes helpful. You know, I was a very, very conservative Republican legislator. I was probably the predominant sponsor of women's legislation dealing with sexual issues, whether they were rape or what it was. And I often found it beneficial once I was firmly committed to something, to go to the other side of the aisle and to find a woman on the Democratic side of the aisle, and to just sit down and to explain to her and say, you know, this is such a terrible practice, and it just seems inhuman that we would let this go on and not do anything. And I often had very good luck with doing that type of thing. And then it doesn't become just a partisan issue. It becomes a bipartisan issue. We had an issue dealing with rape test kits, and I was intensely interested in it. And the next thing, I had National Organization of Women working with me, and then I had our Democratic governor's wife become extremely interested, and so you had this, you know, truly a bipartisan, you know, from the very, very right side of the spectrum to the very left part, and it allowed you to move rather fluidly and to enact good legislation where you didn't have hang-ups based on some ideological view. So I think that's really a large part of how we achieved it here in Virginia.
I think that's a really good point, and that's something that we've been trying here in Massachusetts too, is definitely get bipartisan support, which I'm happy to report we do have on our bill. So I'm very hopeful that it actually will pass today. But I think also, just to your point, Senator Black, was that I think there is this, not just at the political but partisan level, but I think also working on this issue and talking about education, and Gabriela, you alluded to this, but being able to cross-collaborate between various fields is so important in terms of working on this issue and being able to educate all fields as well. I think that you do need to learn from health professionals, you need to learn from frontline professionals as educators, how they're encountering this, from child protective services, from community members, obviously. But I think in general, recognizing that we need to have this multi-sectoral approach, and that includes within education on this issue, is just incredibly important.
And another question I'm seeing in the chat is that FGM is connected as a religious practice, and how can we eradicate that?
So I think, again, I can start, but please feel free to answer this. I think it's important we address this in our misconceptions, that often it is considered a religious practice. And I think there are various justifications given within communities for why it continues, and religion is one of them. And I think that's where it's really important within communities, if you have religious leaders who can come out and speak against this too. And there are many religious leaders in many different faiths that do speak out against this. That's important. But also, again, just going back to the fact that even if it is something that one community, and I'm speaking, I grew up in the Bora community, and so within the Bora community is considered a religious practice, and oftentimes they refer to other texts besides the Quran to justify it. But I think it's important to recognize that no religion should justify harm for any child, and that is something that it's a sensitive issue to talk about, but I think it's important to recognize that bottom line. But again, that this is not being done by one religion, one culture, but regardless of the reason given, it's important just to talk about the fact that this is happening on a child, that's too young to be able to consent, and the fact that there can be lifelong consequences, both physical, emotional, sexual, psychological, and that this is a human rights violation. So I think it's just really important, again, to recognize all of those realities too.
Well, I point out also that, there certainly is a strong Islamic element of this, but not a great part of the Islamic world does not accept this. So it's not as though it is so ingrained in the religious faith that it's carried out everywhere. It's in certain areas. Now, I do believe that areas of the United States that are that have a large Islamic population, for example, in Minnesota, if we can get strong laws, if we can get instruction, in a way, we might be sort of the key to beginning to spread the idea that this is unacceptable, and not simply to do it here in the United States, but gradually to have it begin to take hold in countries abroad that do have a very wide spread practice of religious-based female genital mutilation. So I think to some extent the first thing is to get hold of it here. But I do know there are some very heroic women in Africa and parts of the Middle East who have devoted their lives to ending this practice, and for them it's a very challenging prospect, but we need to help them in every way that we can.
Definitely, I think it's really important to, again, those communities, those that understand these nuances, and being able to work with them too and advocate their work. So I just recognize that we only have a few more minutes. So with that in mind, thank you all for attending. And I would just like to ask the speakers if there's anything else that any one of you would like to bring up before we end the webinar today.
This is Gabrielle. I was wondering, there's a comment that came up in the chat, and I was wondering if maybe Angela might want to speak to this. Angela, they were asking about whether or not it's considered child abuse. And I think that was one of the things that you and I, when we developed the resource and a suggestion for a protocol, we knew that in the US that is the case, but it varies from state to state, right?
Yes, it does vary from state to state. In fact, I recall when we trained the Fairfax County detectives and police force, that came up because we have strong child abuse laws here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they asked what was the difference. Well, why did we need a specific FGM law when we already had a stringent child abuse law? But it wasn't just, we were not just thinking, like Senator Black mentioned in his presentation, that the law is more of a deterrent, to be used as a deterrent than anything else. And so child abuse, yes, I believe the federal government also acknowledges FGM as a form of child abuse.
Right. And I put in the link, I put in the chat a link to a summary of mandatory reporting of child abuse, because it varies from state to state, who is the mandatory reporters, how they have to report. And one of the things that we included in our guidance is acknowledgement that as schools come up with what they're going to do, they need to be very clear with what their state law is with regard to child abuse reporting, and then how that is carried out.
Yes.
You know, it is important to remember that although I think in every state, the child abuse laws and other criminal laws would cover this, as a practical matter, for the police officer on the beat, they have a certain level of education and training. And to them, this FGM is a rather exotic practice that may not automatically fit their conception of, okay, what are the, you know, I know about speeding, I know about assault, I know about these things, but female genital mutilation, I don't get that. It's kind of a religious practice. And so you may not get the police involved. We had a case in Sterling, Virginia, where a woman was chased by, or a girl was chased by her father with a pair of scissors. And fortunately, there was a neighbor who restrained the father, stopped him from going after his daughter, called the police. But it's unclear what happened with the police, but they eventually turned the daughter back over to the father. And I would not be surprised if he carried out the mutilation. Because of this ignorance, it's not that the police don't mean to do well, it's that it's confusing to them. They don't understand it. So if they have something explicit that they can rely on, then we're much more likely to see some enforcement from the public officials.
Well, this is why it's so important. Education, we cannot stress education enough, not only for it being in the schools, but also for law enforcement and everybody that will be involved in protecting those little girls.
Thank you.
So thank you, guys. We're a little bit over our time, so I want to take this moment to thank everybody in the audience for attending, and to thank all of our wonderful speakers for joining this webinar today and educating us. And just a reminder, we'll send all these slides and resources and hopefully a recording of the webinar. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.